Welcome to this discussion with 5 key voices from Hemsley Fraser. We'll be talking about the actions prompted by the 6 pairs of traits that came out of our own analysis of leadership in the balance. This insight focused on the unprecedented challenges facing leaders in both the short and the longer term, with the goal of creating an environment where our teams can come together and channel their energies into creating something positive. So welcome, panel. So if we could come to you first, Lindsay, and you could just explain to us what you understand and what actions we should be considering around communicating a compelling strategic direction.
Yeah, so what's really key about creating a compelling strategic direction is making sure that people feel connected to it. Especially at the moment, it's really around getting that collaboration and getting people really connected up to what the vision is and how to drive people forward. I think one of the things that's quite difficult at the moment is having that flexibility and the agility to be able to pivot within your vision and within that strategic direction. So what is really key in all of this is to make sure that everybody feels that from their point of view, they can understand what they need to do to really drive the business forward. So it's very much about how you communicate that in a way that people can feel connected to it, how you open up the conversation, and certainly for the people who are leading the strategic direction is make sure that they're in a listening mode as well and not being rigid around, you know, the fact that this can't be flexible or it can't move or shift, but making sure it's a two-way conversation. So there's some really key things at the moment. It's quite, you know, it's not as black and white as perhaps as it has been before, where you'll be very clear on a set direction forward. There does need to be that agility. So, you know, making sure that those communication lines are open and you're keeping people updated. It's not just the people at the top of the organisation. You have that collaborative approach.
And part of that, Lindsay, is it also important, because you're not going to have all the answers, is it important to give the team time to think about what you're communicating and come back to you or challenge you or ask questions?
Yeah, absolutely. When you're shifting your strategic direction, if you're just going to be blinkered and say, no, it's this, you've got to be open to understanding this from multiple different points of view, from the market and how the market is shifting, but also from your colleagues and from the team around you. There's no point in going 500 miles ahead if nobody's coming with you, because you're just setting a direction for yourself and like-minded people. So you have to make sure that it's something that enables others to come on that journey with you and they feel like they understand where they're going to. It's a bit like you paint the picture and people can see which part they have to play in terms of making that come to life.
That's great. Thanks, Lindsay. And Ian over in New York, something to add?
Yes, I really feel strongly about something Lindsay said, which is that it's critical for leaders to draw a line between the strategic vision and what each individual on their team can do to realize the vision, especially in 2020, as we're all sitting at home, we're all separated from each other. It can be very easy to lose that mental connection, that intellectual connection between what I do on a day-to-day basis, sitting at my desk, and how on earth is that possibly helping to drive my business, to drive my company's objectives. The more a manager, the more a leader can draw that direct line, it not only makes this day-to-day challenging work environment feel better, it lightens the load because people really have a much more lofty goal to aspire to. They know that even though they're sitting at their desk for 9, 10, 11 hours a day, that pressing this button, making that phone call, it really is having an impact for all of us. And I think that is just so critical.
That's great. Thanks, Ian. And if I could move on to our other Ian, just to talk about, because that, with all these changes and these new strategic directions, I guess the importance of building capability and capacity is more important than ever.
Yep, indeed. So it's about making us agile as we can. But interestingly, I think to be as agile as you can, you often need stability. So it's kind of a bit like a gymnast on a balance beam. So they have to have that good footing before they can start thinking about being agile and cartwheeling their way down a 4-inch beam. So agility, bizarrely, requires stability, which feels a bit counterintuitive, to be honest. But those things can come from certainly confidence, security, and some optimism. And that's where that intrinsically links with what Lindsay was talking about. So you can have confidence in that direction as you go forward. Now, once you've got that confidence, security, and optimism, then it's a little bit about how do we develop the people to make them as agile as we can. So yes, it's got to be linked to where we want to be going, but we've got to give them the tools to get there. Now, along that route, of course, what's going to happen, and if I go back to my gymnast simile, they're going to fall off the beam at some point, and that's kind of okay. So bizarrely, again, counterintuitively, we want to optimize failure. So it's all right to fall off the beam because we're going to give you the tools to get back on it and make sure we can cartwheel on. So there's that failure is acceptable. That's okay, because that will make us more agile going forward. And with that comes that kind of positivity. We have to stick at it. Now, of course, the last thing linked here with agility is sometimes we can have confidence, we can have security, we can have a strategic direction, and then something can appear completely out of the blue that we hadn't imagined. I can't think of anything that's happened over the past few months like that. But that's when, if we've got all the other building blocks in place, we have that ability to move and go down a different direction. So therefore, learning does become fundamental to being as agile as we can be. And I think the more we can do that going forward, the greater ability we'll have to move in case another serious situation occurs going forward.
And Ian, with your experience in training, is there a need to sort of get our workforce, get our people in the mood to adapt and the mood to build? I mean, to go back to your gymnast, they want to get on the beam.
Yeah, and I guess we got to kind of warm them up, and so the leader has that real role about reassurance, about, as I mentioned, about accepting failure, but also setting them up to succeed to the best of their ability. So we've got to make sure they've got the right tools to hit the beam hard, and yeah, without doubt that the leader has to do that. But you know, that learning becomes the ongoing process. I mean, I'll talk more about it a little bit more, but that's where the whole lead by example comes in, all of those kind of things as well.
That's great. Thanks, Ian. And then over to back to our other Ian, talking about creating this climate that then fuels the engines of success. So, you know, we've recognized that skill sets need to change, but now we need to push on and actually achieve things. Could you talk us through that a little bit?
Sure. I think, again, I'll go back to, as we all have referenced, the great challenges and uncertainty in 2020. I think the biggest role, the most important role of a leader right now is to set a tone in which, even though the situations are challenging, the team can thrive. Most people have a very good gut instinct and a very highly attuned sense of what to do in a normal situation. But the minute that things change, whether it's about COVID-19, the political situation, working from home, the minute things change and become uncertain, we naturally look to others for signals about how to react, how to behave. Of course, if you're in an organization and you have a manager, you're probably looking to your manager, to your leader for those signals. It is therefore very, very important that the leader, first of all, remains very, very calm, remains positive, even in the face of some serious challenges, but focuses a little bit more maybe on empathy and understanding than they might have in the past. I think, and I'll be honest about this, in the past, I think when I've managed people, I've probably focused a little bit too much more on making sure the work gets done and done well. I've grown to learn that's only part of the role of a manager, and it's going to take a lot of, I don't want to say hand holding, it'll take a lot of understanding, it'll take a lot of extra conversations, it might take a lot of reassuring to expect or to drive anywhere near formal levels of production and workflow than we've had in the past. That doesn't mean that a manager shouldn't still be decisive. That doesn't mean that a manager shouldn't still drive the work forward. But in a world in which it can be very challenging just to go to the doctor, in a world where it can be very challenging just to stay focused, we might have to take a little bit more time. And I would encourage everyone to take a little bit more time to focus on supporting the employee, not just their work. I'd like to just say one more thing about this subject before opening it up. Something a mentor told me. There's a temptation for managers everywhere, myself included, where if I've asked an employee to do work and the work didn't get done, but the employee has a really good story about why it didn't get done, we sort of accept that. But that's not the role of the manager. The role of the manager is to help the employee overcome the barriers he or she might be facing. So absolutely be empathetic. If someone needs to take some time off to handle family issues or because they're having an emotionally rough day, absolutely understand why the work didn't get done. Now take that next step and help them overcome those barriers and help them still succeed, even in the face of overwhelming challenges.
Thanks, Ian. And I know Eleanor's got something to add on this topic. Eleanor, any thoughts?
Yeah, I really just wanted to agree very emphatically with what Ian's just said. And it's, it's the shifting role of the leader and what it means to be a leader. And I think in past eras, we've seen leaders as being like the kind of hero figure that jumps in and saves the day and rescues things and, is in charge and is, has all the answers and has all the power and control. And I think this conversation's been shifting for a number of years, but what's happened in 2020 has probably shifted it even more towards actually it's about empathy, it's about compassion, it's about listening, it's about understanding, it's about being inclusive, because everyone's being affected by the pandemic in different ways, and it has different impacts on our ability to just show up at work and do our job and get things done. So as a leader, you need to understand everybody's unique position and the unique impact that it's having on that person and use that as a lever by which to get the best out of them. So it's not about letting people off the hook. So it's still getting the best out of people, but doing it in a way that demonstrates empathy and compassion.
That's great. Thanks, Anna. And Ian C., something to add to this topic?
Yeah, it's just a very simple quote that I heard by someone who I know well, a lot of people will be very familiar with, in Simon Sinek. But early on in the scenario we find ourselves in, I heard him do a little talk, and he said that the role of the leader has changed, and we now have to stop asking where are you and asking how are you. And it really resonated with me and kind of ties up with what both Ian and Eleanor have said. So I think that's how the change is occurring, but it's one that stuck with me for the past few months.
That's great. Thanks, Ian. And Lindsay, something to add on this topic before we move on?
Yeah, so I absolutely agree with what Eleanor was just saying there, that about the shift and the change in the leadership role. And it's rather than this kind of top-down approach, this is what you do, this is the strategy, this is where we're going, you follow what I say. I think leadership has to shift much more to a facilitation role. It's about listening and understanding, lots of different ideas and concepts, and being able to bring that together and connect the pieces so it pulls together into one storyline, and so everybody feels that they're connected to it and they've got a part to play. But if you go at that from very command and control approach as a leader, then you might not get the results that you've been hoping for. Whereas if you sit back in that facilitation role and trying to connect the dots and almost be that master architect of how it all comes together and play the story back, then that's a much more effective way of leading people forward.
Yeah, that's great. Thanks, Lindsay. And I guess that leads perfectly into our next action, Eleanor, which is this need to instill leadership at all levels within our organisations and really embolden everyone in the workforce.
Yeah, absolutely. It really does lead into that very neatly, and it kind of comes back to the fundamental question of what a leader is. And of course, if you ask 100 people that question, you'll get 100 different answers. And if you Google it, you'll get 100 research studies, if not thousands of research studies about it. But if you take it back to its most kind of fundamental premise, is that a leader is someone who has followers, and people will choose who to follow. So you may be in a leadership kind of hierarchical position in an organization. So people may do what you want them to do and do what you say because you're the boss and because you have that authority. But actually, if you think about what being a leader really means, it's about having people follow you and having people choose to follow you. And that can be leading a country, leading an organization, but it also could be leading a small project team or taking the lead in a conversation or in a debate, or in a development coaching situation or something like that. So in reality, anyone at any level in an organization can lead. And if you want to be a leader, then all you need to do is act like a leader and, you know, inspire people and influence people and enable people and empower people and listen to people and give them a vision to work towards that you can kind of help them to fulfill. And that's really what being a leader is about. So absolutely, it's about empowerment and enabling people at any level of the organization to take the lead, whether it's within a project or within a team meeting or within the one-to-one situation. So if somebody happens to have skills or expertise or a burning desire to take the lead on a particular kind of project or a particular conversation, then the kind of hierarchical leaders need to allow that and enable that, and sometimes actually give explicit permission. So if the organisational culture perhaps doesn't support that as a generally accepted way of working, and there isn't perhaps that level of psychological safety where people feel that they can just kind of take the lead, then as an organisational leader, as a manager, you need to explicitly say to people, right now, I'm going to step back and I'm going to become the follower because I recognise that in this particular scenario, you have a greater ability to lead. So it's back to that kind of empathy and humility as a leader to know when to step back and know when to follow.
Yeah, that humility word is really important, I guess, in this context. Yeah, Malcolm, something to add around this topic?
Yeah, absolutely. There's a point that Eleanor made, excuse me, in terms of enablement, and what we're seeing with organizations right now is really kind of twofold. One is developing these individuals in specific programs as leaders on various levels, whether it's from the early career to mid to some of the senior leadership. And those are very specific programs, and we've done a good job in working with organizations with that. But what Eleanor is really hitting on that's important, that sometimes gets forgotten, is the talent within the organization, which is everyone. Understanding how people can be empowered to do things and having that as part of the overall culture or the climate, which we were talking about earlier, can be a powerful thing to do. It takes the ability for the entire organization to embrace this idea from the leadership down, so that the culture can have a culture of leadership, enabling different types of people to come in to step up as leaders so they feel like they can lead no matter how big or small it is, outside of the formal programs that may exist. But also, again, we need to focus on developing the general talent of our organizations.
Great. Yeah. Thanks, Malcolm. And Ian C., something to add?
I think it's sometimes with leadership and how we can get it all down is we kind of made it a bit unattainable. So if we kind of talk about who's a great leader, we kind of say, oh, you know, Gandhi or Martin Luther King or whatever, and it's like, oh, I've only got a 2-day training program, but if you ask most people who inspired you, who led you to do something better, I'd go, oh well. Dave O'Callaghan, who was my games master at school, or Andy Watton, who was my first boss when I started work, and yet nobody knows those people. So they're miles more attainable, and people that we can turn to because they did lead us. They had no hierarchical authority over me; they just inspired me. And sometimes there's, you know, I've got a son, and he inspires me, so he leads me. He doesn't know. But he does. He has no authority, and I think that's important. And it's that kind of stuff we've got to get away from. We're all going to be Steve Jobs, because that makes it very, very difficult. particularly in the time we've got, and make it something, those little moments that can change people and make them better. And I think that will always add to leadership.
Yeah. And can I stay with you, Ian, just to talk about the next action, because values is something that organisations have been sort of talking about and grappling with for some time, and I guess now even more important than ever.
Yep. Always a hot topic, values, and we see them everywhere, and companies organising them and putting them on posters and putting them around the wall. And I have no problem with values being up on the wall. That's fine, because we're going to get them in a shared space. Let's get them advertised. But values are embodied on the floor of the business, wherever that floor may be. And I've worked in a variety of organisations. One had 4-foot-high values in the foyer, and before I'd even crossed the threshold of the building, I'd seen them broken by half the people who were going into the building. So let's not just put a poster up. We've got to breathe them. And if I go back to my previous point about who was a great leader, and I said Martin Luther King. Martin Luther King actually said that we're measured not where a man stands in times of comfort, but where he stands in times of challenge. And I think that's a really key thing. It's easy to be great at a value display when things are running for you, but perhaps when you're under pressure, that's when the values really kick in. How do I show my values under pressure in a crisis? Now, honesty is one of the words we hear, and we do hear a lot of these classic words. And if I asked 50 people walking down the street what their values were, they probably wouldn't map in with a lot that I see in FTSE 100s or Fortune 500s values. So it's about, can we make them accessible to people? Are they going to be real to people? And of course, the thing with a lot of them is if something could just break them. I think one that comes up is like trust. That's a great value for an organization. You might say, well, that's a given. Surely that's going to be everybody's value. But trust, if I give you some things that will build trust, they're going to sound so ridiculous and insignificant that they don't count. But it's over a period of time that values are embedded into an organization. But if it goes once, then the trust is broken. So it's kind of like, if I brush my teeth every day for 2 minutes, what does it do? Well, nothing. I have to brush my teeth for 2 minutes, morning and evening, 5 minutes, go to the dentist 3 or 4 times a year. But just brushing them for 5 minutes in the morning, I go, well, they don't feel any better, I'll stop doing it. And it's all those kind of things. It has to be in everything that we do. So there's got to be that big display. There's got to be honesty about what values are, and there's got to be visual displays almost in everything that we do. And I mean, I am passionate about my own personal values, and that's crucial as well, that people have an opportunity, because if their personal values, if they're very clear on their personal values, they'll be far more committed to the organizational values. A lot of the time values come top down, but if we can go bottom up, top down and meet in the middle, then people are committed and they'll buy into them. And that's proven in research after research. Organizations will spend hundreds of thousands of pounds, dollars, working out and telling what people's values should be. And it's like, I know what my values are. And so that honesty, that discussion, and every minute of every working day, what have I done today that shows people my values? And I think that's a crucial thing for people to work with.
And I guess that meeting in the middle also helps buy-in from your employees and from your team and all that sort of stuff.
Absolutely, that's the thing, because if they're clear on their values and they see the organisational values, they'll see the weave. They're not always going to meet like that. Perhaps they might meet a bit like that, and but that's fine.
Yeah.
But it's better than having no meat.
Yeah. Ian in New York, something to add?
A couple of things to add. First of all, I'm no longer sure that I'm brushing my teeth for enough in the morning and the afternoon, so I'm going to add a few minutes to that. Thanks, Ian. I'll take your advice so I keep my pearly whites. The other thing I'd like to say, and it was early on in your discussion when you talked about the truth of values, living or dying when things go wrong. I would say for anyone who has the privilege to be working on a values project is to, before these things are put on a poster, to ask your senior management team some really serious questions. For example, if one of your values is we do the right thing, and I've been proud to work at a company who had that as its values, before that is printed up, before you waste any ink or pixels, it's really important to challenge the senior team. If someone comes to you with evidence that we're doing the wrong thing, what are you going to do? Because if the moment we produce and promote values, the very moment, like trust can be lost in a moment, all of these values can be lost in a moment if there's even a hint that senior management isn't committed to following them in both times of plenty and times of challenge.
Great, thanks. Yeah, that whole living the values in times of challenge, I think, is really interesting. But Eleanor, something also to add on this topic?
Yeah, just really, again, underlining what the guys have said. It's about authenticity for me. So I think, as we can all kind of say, oh yeah, corporate values, you see the same stuff time after time, we do the right thing, integrity, whatever it may be. You see similar themes, don't you, arising in so many organizations. And yet in many of those organizations, you can probably pinpoint many occasions where on a daily basis, those values are not lived up to at the very top by the very people that tell everybody else that they need to live by those values. So I think they have to be authentic, otherwise, frankly, don't bother. And the other point as well is about connecting it to individuals' values. So it kind of comes back to what Lindsay was talking about at the start, about the vision and the strategic vision being compelling, and people need to be able to connect to it. And the same is of values. So people need to be able to connect their own personal values to the organization's values. And that might not be immediately clear to everybody. So that's a piece of work that as a manager or leader, you need to do with everybody in your team to say, okay, these are our organizational values. How do these link to your personal values? How can you make these come alive in a way that is still real and true and authentic for you as an individual? Because no doubt that you will be able to make that link, like Ian was saying before, but it might not be obvious. So there's a little bit of piece of work that needs to be done to really kind of unpick it all and make sure that people can connect their heart and their mind to the organizational values in a way that is authentic for them as well.
Yeah. Lindsay, I saw you nodding there. Have you got something to add to that point?
Yeah, I think being authentic is something that's really, really important. If you think about something like a value of doing the right thing, now as leaders and certainly people that look after people, all of us want to make sure that our people are looked after. If you think about something that we're going through, all of us at the moment, where businesses are very, very stretched, and you've got the complexity of balancing the business viability with people's well-being. You're being asked to do kind of more with less, or it's a really difficult kind of balance. And how do you make sure that you're authentic to your values in that position? So I think there is something here about communicating when there are some really complex scenarios going on, and how as a leader you're trying to do the right thing, but in doing the right thing, it's doing the right thing for the business, doing the right thing for the people, doing the right thing for the owners of the business, or whatever that might be. So there might be multiple different ways of looking at the value. And I think by explaining some of that and keeping an open dialogue around how complex that might be, it might seem very simple to certain people, and saying, well, hang on, why aren't we living the values here? But I think having that open dialogue and being able to tell the story around how you are trying to live the values is really important, as well, as the complexity becomes more and more difficult for leaders.
Yeah, so it's not just the living the values, it's what we're doing to try and live those values almost. Yeah. Great, thanks everybody for that one. Malcolm, if I could come to you for the next action, which is around prioritizing, simplifying and aligning on information and data.
Absolutely. So again, back to this pandemic that we've all been unfortunately thrown into, has really kind of changed our priorities. It's really kind of changed how we look at information. And I look at it from a micro and a macro standpoint. At home, of course, we've had to be able to prioritize ourselves, figure out what our new priorities are. How do we simplify what we're doing so that we're dealing with all the other things that are happening? We look at how we're aligning with others in our families. And that was a difficult, thing for us to do. And it's still an ongoing change that we're dealing with today. Once we're past this, pandemic and move on, then we have other adjustments. How does work look to us? How's our family life look to us moving forward? From a business standpoint and a micro standpoint, we really want to focus on, what the priorities are that we're doing that makes sense today. So, for example, Hemsley Fraser, we're starting to look more and more at the needs of our clients, and that's the virtual space that we're in. How do we move forward in the virtual space? Are we going to do new creative things like virtual reality? How do we prioritize what we currently do, what we want to do, what's good for the client? That's up to individuals, but it's also up to teams and up to groups as we move forward. We also have to simplify it too. One of the things that I really preach, if you will, to my clients is, if we're doing things for a project, if you don't have simplification, you're going to have a lot of complexities that you don't want to have to deal with. For example, I'm working with Ian Klein on this right now, and it's return on expectations for one of our major clients. And if we're able to touch our projects for the entire organization, then it really must be something that's very simple. If we're doing evaluations of work that we're doing, no one really wants to focus on 4 levels of evaluations that go into a serious ROI. But if we simplify how we look at that, align with all the divisions, then it creates a culture that becomes very powerful for us to be able to use and reuse for the work that we do. So, we're, in 2020 and moving into 2021, our brains, and studies have shown this, have the capacity to absorb tons of information, much more than any other point in history. But the key is not just gathering that information, but turning that information into knowledge, and then taking that knowledge, if we can, moving forward and making it to wisdom.
Yeah, that's great. And yeah, I really like that bit on the sort of focusing on the output over input, which, if we're all remote working, seems really relevant in that it's not clocking in and clocking out, it's what you're actually delivering on. But Ian, Kay, something to add to that?
Yes, thank you, John. Something Malcolm said struck me as so new and so critical. It's a new role of managers and leaders everywhere. Whoever thought even 5 years ago that we would be in a world that was so utterly pelting us with different messages, different distractions, different views on facts. We are, each of us, getting hundreds of emails, thousands of emails. There's Facebook, Instagram, all these different things up to and including TikTok that are vying for our attention, both personally and professionally. And a new role of a manager, or a more reinforced, more important role of a manager, is actually helping employees focus and keep to that list of priorities. One thing that we've been doing in our team at Hemsley Fraser US that I recommend for any team anywhere is having a very quick morning stand-up where we have that one brief 15-minute opportunity to align on our priorities for the day. Because what gets talked about gets done, what gets written gets done, what gets focused on gets done. And in a world that has completely lost all hope of focusing, it's the leader's role to help try to bring that back. That, more than anything else, is going to drive the team forward.
Thanks, Ian. Malcolm, something to add just to sort of bring this action, summarize this whole thing?
Yeah, absolutely. And Ian kind of mentioned a couple of things that kind of hit close to something that I was listening to this morning. I was listening to a Blinkist on a book called Clearer, Closer, and Better by Emily Balcetis. And it really focuses on the idea of, when you prioritize, ensuring that you have a clear focus and very defined focus on what that is. And that's really what leads to success. Not to take away, understand the bigger picture, because that also should be thought through, but success first starts with having that focus on what those specific priorities are when we have, again, as Ian talked about, I talked about earlier, all these many things that are grabbing our attention day to day.
Great. Yeah, thanks, Matt. And that's a perfect lead in to our seventh and final action on that whole thing about the bigger picture, in this sort of this balance between focusing on the near term and achieving what we need to do in the short term, but also not losing that bigger picture, that long term situation as well. Because I guess in the near term it might be about just paying the bills, but longer term you still want to develop and grow the business, as it were. So we're going to open this one up to the group. If I could just ask you guys what you might have anything to add to that. If come to Ian in New York first.
Sure. I think back to what Ian Caldecourt said. It's all about Simon Sinek, and start with why. We had to ask ourselves in March, April, and May why we had to do things a different way. We still have to ask not only the short-term why, but always ask why are we doing this? Why are we in this marketplace? Why are we in this business? And if you can keep a short-term why, medium-term why, and a long-term why, I think that'll help.
Yeah.
And Lindsay, could I come to you just to comment on that? Because that's something that seems very relevant to a lot of the stuff you've been talking about internally and maybe externally too, in terms of that sort of, we might have to do things slightly different in the short term, but our long-term vision is still this, our values are still here, and we're still the same people.
Absolutely. And I think this comes down to transformation, right? You're not going to go from being one thing to something else instantly. It just doesn't happen that way. It's a journey, and it's a journey that, lots of people are learning and going through an enormous amount of change. And as we think about the Kubler-Ross kind of change curve, you've got different people at different times, all in different places against that curve. And so you have to ensure that you're kind of going on that journey and allow for people to go through that process of change and transformation. So therefore you need to have, okay, this is the short term, this is what we're working to now, and then this, and then this. If you just go straight from this to this, you're going to lose people. They're going to say, I don't know how to get there, and they might just stay over here, and then you've got that problem with the leadership being way out in head. So how do you allow for that, for people to come through that curve with you and go on that transformation, and how do you make those kind of those smaller goals? So one, it keeps motivation up and people feel like you're achieving something, and you can gradually build towards the overall vision. But just pivoting very, very quickly with a lot of people is very, very difficult. So you've got to do that in a way that's sustainable in terms of energy, and sustainable in terms of actually meeting those goals. And it isn't just a nice vision written on a piece of paper. It actually becomes a reality.
Yeah, thanks, Lindsay. Malcolm, something to add?
Absolutely. I think Lindsay really hit this mark. Change in a culture change to transition from short term to long term is really key. If we have individuals who aren't afraid of change, and that afraid happens sometimes, when you're afraid, it happens sometimes culturally, but when we have an environment where leaders allow for people to have a different mindset, being okay with saying, I don't understand this, but I want to figure it out. It's kind of Brene Brown's whole vulnerability piece. But if we're able to take the information that we have and say, I'm not sure, but I think this is a direction we want to go, and a change that could be for the better for ourselves, for our teams, for our clients, then the short term becomes much more an advantage for the long term within our climate that we're in. So I don't want to take anything away from the idea of change as being a huge agent here. But what we have to do is really understand that with change actually comes the idea of people accepting and embracing change within the culture.
Thanks, Malcolm. And Eleanor, something more along this thought?
Yeah, I was just kind of reflecting on this as we were discussing it actually, and thinking, relating it to, personally how I feel right now is that the kind of the near future is so unpredictable, is so uncertain, is changing every day. It's very difficult to kind of to deal with that, and it is distressing, it's upsetting, it's frustrating. And at a kind of a national level or an international level even, the long-term future looks quite uncertain as well. So actually, I think on an organisational level, if you can keep people focused on a purpose, a meaning, a vision of the future that's positive, and you know who we are and where we want to be, I think that can be really reassuring, and it provides people with an anchor that they can connect to. So when you're showing up for work every day, you've got that sense of meaning and purpose, and you know what it is that you're trying to do and why you're trying to do it. Even when everything else around you is completely chaotic, it actually kind of makes the organisation kind of become a safe haven, as somewhere where I do know what I'm doing and I do know why I'm doing it. And I know how it's connected to a wider purpose that is going to benefit lots of other people and not just me. So I think actually it's really important to have that, the long-term focus, and then the kind of the near-term stuff sort of falls into place. If everyone can connect to that, to the purpose, to the strategic vision, to the values and everything else that we've already been talking about, I think it's actually a really helpful anchor for people in the times of uncertainty.
I love that. I love the idea of the workplace being the harbour in the storm. That's
Who'd have thought it?
And finally, Ian C, could you just bring it all together for us?
Well, do you know, I mean, it's just reinforcing points really, but it's about, I think in the times that we live in, you can get so caught up in the short term that you lose sight of the long term. And even just as we were sitting here reflecting, in the UK, one of the short-term goals for seemingly quite a lot of people is, where can I get a toilet roll? And they become so obsessive about that they actually forget what the bigger picture is. And I think in business, we need to do the same. We can get so caught up in just shifting stuff from point A to point B that we've forgotten what the big why is. What is the thing that we're going for? And sometimes we might have to a degree, fall off. We might have to miss something short term to make sure we hit the longer term goal. And I think it's very easy to get caught up, under day-to-day pressure, and fail to expand your vision and see further on. And that's where the leaders can help as well.
Which, going back to your gymnast thing, is not focusing just on the somersault, but getting the whole routine done or something.
Yeah, you got to land it.
There you go.
You got to land it.
Excellent. Well, I'm sure there's lots of good stuff there. Thank you, everybody. We could probably continue this conversation for a lot longer, but time has run out. So thanks very much for your time and for your insight into sort of taking us through these challenging times. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.